In the winter of 1874, in the frozen mining town of Blackridge, Colorado, the official records from the county courthouse noted an accident that should have ended in nothing but funerals, yet what unfolded would challenge the limits of medicine, morality, and human endurance in ways the frontier doctors of that era could never explain. The case revolved around a boy named Samuel Hayes, just 11 years old, who was buried alive beneath tons of collapsing rock and timber in a silver mine for nearly 5 days and somehow pulled out breathing, though he was shattered, starved, and poisoned with dust. His body a ruin that local physicians insisted would never see another sunrise. But Samuel did live, and what followed was a descent into a kind of medical nightmare that turned survival into something darker than death itself. The mine at Blackridge had been a chaotic place, fueled by investors from Denver desperate to pull as much ore as possible from the Rockies, and most of the workers were either immigrants fresh off trains, young boys too small to be soldiers, or desperate widowers clinging to wages that barely bought bread at the overpriced company store. And Samuel had joined their ranks after his father was killed in a blasting accident months earlier, leaving his mother, Eliza Hayes, to care for 3 children in a cramped boarding shack the company owned, a home they could lose at any moment if rent wasn't paid in full. Samuel's small hands and wiry frame made him a perfect fit for the narrow shafts that older miners hated. So for a few pennies a day, he crawled through darkness with a lamp tied to his head, dragging carts of ore to the mule lifts, work that left his lungs coated in metallic dust and his bones aching long before he reached manhood. The man overseeing medical care at Blackridge was Dr. Nathaniel Crow, a physician sent from Chicago with a glittering resume and a cold reputation. And while the miners respected his skill at pulling men through fevers and fractures, they whispered that his eyes lingered too long on their wounds, as though he were studying not how to heal, but how to learn from the suffering itself. And hidden away in his quarters, Crow kept journals written in a cramped hand, full of sketches, diagrams, and questions that had little to do with mercy and everything to do with endurance, thresholds, and pain. On the morning of January 9th, 1874, Samuel descended into Shaft 4, the deepest passage of the Blackridge complex, where a series of powder charges had been planted by a careless foreman named Mason Burke. And when one fuse ran too fast, the mountain itself seemed to roar with fury, rock folding in on itself and crushing every beam meant to hold it up. Men screamed, carts overturned, oil lamps exploded into sparks, and in the chaos, Samuel dove beneath a half-filled ore wagon just as the ceiling collapsed, sealing him into a pocket of space so tight he could barely move his arms, entombed 200 feet beneath the frozen Colorado soil. Above ground, the rescue was immediate, yet hopeless, as teams of exhausted miners clawed at stone with bleeding hands, knowing full well that each passing hour meant the difference between uncovering the living or the dead. And Samuel's mother stood among the snowdrifts outside the mine entrance, her eyes raw from weeping and her lips whispering prayers that no one dared to interrupt. By the 3rd day, most believed the boy was gone, yet Dr. Crow watched the rescue not with grief, but with a strange intensity, scribbling notes about stress, despair, and the toll of waiting on the families. And when, on the 5th day, they finally broke through and dragged Samuel out, unconscious but somehow alive, Crow's fascination became obsession. The child's body was mangled, his ribs broken, arm shattered, skull bruised, skin lacerated, but against all odds, his chest still rose with shallow breaths. And while others called it a miracle, Crow saw in it the rarest opportunity, one that frontier medicine could never offer again. And thus Samuel Hayes was taken not to his mother's care, but into the dimly lit infirmary built beside the mine, where Crow began what he insisted were treatments, yet in truth were trials, pushing the boy into cycles of bleeding, dosing, and exposure meant not to heal, but to answer questions Crow himself could not stop asking. How much can a child endure before the body breaks? How much poison can flow through a system before it fails? And how quickly can wounds be forced to mend when stripped and reopened again? Samuel's recovery, if it could be called that, defied explanation, for bones set faster than expected, skin closed before infection could take hold, and doses of mercury or opium that should have killed him instead left him trembling yet alive. And this resilience only drove Crow deeper into his frenzy, convincing him that he was uncovering something that might rewrite the rules of survival itself. Eliza Hayes, exhausted and terrified, sat at her son's bedside day after day, soothed by Crow's calm assurances that everything being done was for Samuel's good, never realizing that the physician had already filed away official records marking her boy as deceased in the mine collapse, erasing him from the ledgers so that no authority might ask why he was still alive. And thus Samuel Hayes became not a patient, but a secret, hidden in plain sight, a living experiment in the cold grip of a man who no longer saw him as a child, but that as the key to unlocking a future where flesh itself could be made indestructible. And what began as a story of impossible survival was already transforming into something much more unsettling, something that would haunt the valleys of Blackridge long after the snow melted from its peaks. By February of 1874, the winter storms that battered Blackridge had turned the mining town into a prison of snow and silence. Yet inside the infirmary, Samuel Hayes lived on in defiance of every prediction, his battered frame resisting collapse in a way that both terrified and enthralled Dr. Nathaniel Crow, whose journals by now contained page after page of tightly written notes, charts of Samuel's pulse under stress, sketches of wounds reopened and measured, and calculations of how long a boy might endure without water, warmth, or sleep, all documented with the detachment of a scientist studying not a patient, but a specimen. And though Crow presented himself to the miners as a savior who had drawn a child back from the grave, in truth he had transformed Samuel's survival into an experiment so secret that even the mining company's records now listed the boy among the dead, his name crossed from the payroll ledgers, his existence erased so Crow could work without interference. Eliza Hayes remained devoted to her son's bedside, though she understood less and less of what was happening, for Crow cloaked every new torment in the language of progress, insisting that the bleeding was necessary to purge impurities, that the mercury drafts would protect against infection, that the forced exposure to freezing air was a test of the lungs' resilience against the mountain climate. And though Eliza's instincts screamed that these treatments were cruel, her fear of losing Samuel a second time chained her into obedience, for how could a mother deny the man who had already performed what others called a miracle? Samuel himself had begun to change, in ways subtle at first, then startling, his body adapting with unnatural speed, bruises fading in days, bones knitting faster than Crow's textbooks claimed possible, and the boy's mind, though often fogged by drugs, seemed to sharpen in odd bursts, allowing him to repeat conversations he had overheard while half-conscious, to describe with eerie precision the reactions of men in the infirmary, and even to predict Crow's movements before the doctor made them, as though months trapped between life and death had tuned his senses toward survival in a way beyond ordinary human measure. Whispers began to circulate among the miners, who had noticed the absence of the boy's body from the cemetery where the other victims of the collapse were buried, and though Crow dismissed their questions with claims of a closed casket burial due to disfigurement, suspicions grew that the physician's night hours, punctuated by muffled cries and strange odors of burning chemicals, hid something unspeakable. And yet no one dared challenge him openly, for Crow had powerful backers among the investors in Denver, men who cared little for morality, as long as production from Blackridge's veins continued. Meanwhile, Crow's letters, carried by couriers down the mountain, reached beyond Colorado into circles of medical men hungry for discovery. And in those missives, Crow hinted at an unprecedented subject, whose tolerance for trauma might revolutionize battlefield care, though he never named Samuel directly, only referring to him as the Blackridge specimen. And already, Crow was plotting to transport the boy eastward when conditions allowed, where he might present his findings to universities, or perhaps to military buyers willing to pay fortunes for secrets that could forge soldiers who healed like steel. Samuel, however, was not ignorant of what was happening to him. For though Crow imagined him compliant, the boy was beginning to understand the language of the experiments, piecing together meaning from overheard fragments, watching carefully as instruments were arranged, noting the precise moments when Crow's hand trembled with excitement rather than compassion. And deep within Samuel grew a hard ember of knowledge that his survival had turned into captivity, that he was not being healed, but studied, and that to escape, he would have to endure long enough to strike when no one expected it. Eliza, too, was changing, her exhaustion giving way to suspicion each night she wiped blood from her son's skin, her heart breaking when Samuel whispered that he wanted to go home, not to the shack or the mines, but anywhere beyond Crow's reach. And though she feared defying the doctor, she began to keep her own secret notes, small scraps hidden in her apron, recording each treatment with the quiet desperation of a woman who sensed she might one day need proof of what was done. The thaw of March brought more than melted snow. It brought outsiders, company officials from Denver arriving to inspect the mines, armed Pinkerton men to quell rumors of labor unrest, and with them questions about the doctor's requisitions, for Crow had ordered supplies in quantities far exceeding normal needs, vials of laudanum, syringes of strange design, surgical saws imported from Chicago, and photographic equipment hardly ever seen in such remote places. And though Crow presented forged ledgers, attributing everything to battlefield studies sanctioned by the War Department, one inspector, a shrewd man named Walter Brannock, sensed deceit, noting that Crow guarded his infirmary like a fortress, and families whispered of screams in the night. His quiet inquiries threatened to unravel everything, yet fate, or Crow's cunning, intervened when the inspector was found dead near a ravine, his horse returned riderless, his papers vanished. The death ruled an accident, though few believed it, and among those who most doubted was young Samuel, who whispered to his mother that Crow's boots had left mud trails the night Brannock disappeared. By April, the boy's body bore so many scars that Eliza scarcely recognized him, yet paradoxically, he grew stronger, his appetite ravenous, his eyes more alert, and Crow, far from easing his hand, escalated his trials, forcing Samuel to endure burns measured with iron rods, heated until they glowed, poisons diluted and timed with a pocket watch, and even simulated drownings in basins of water where Eliza was restrained from interfering. Each time Samuel surviving, each time Crow's hunger for answers intensifying, until even Eliza began to feel that her son had become less child than vessel for some terrible purpose, and she prayed nightly not only for his salvation, but for Crow's soul, though she doubted either prayer would be answered. What no one knew was that Crow's letters had drawn interest not only from doctors, but from men in Washington, connected to secret military bureaus still dreaming of rebuilding power after the Civil War, and by May a coded reply reached Blackridge, promising funds and protection if Crow could deliver his subject intact, turning Samuel Hayes from an unfortunate child into a commodity whose value was measured not in flesh but in potential. And Crow, more convinced than ever of his destiny, began to prepare for transport eastward, unaware that the boy, whose body he had broken and remade, was quietly planning his own escape, one that would not only decide his survival, but expose the hidden rot festering at the heart of Blackridge. By the summer of 1874, Blackridge had become a cauldron of rumor and fear, the miners whispering that something unnatural lived in the infirmary where Dr. Nathaniel Crow kept the lamps burning late into the night. And though the company officials insisted that his work was sanctioned and beneficial, the men who had heard the muffled cries through the stone walls or seen Crow's pale figure moving with surgical precision at midnight no longer believed the comforting lies, while Samuel Hayes, the boy who should have been buried months ago, grew both more fragile and more formidable with each passing day. His body bore dozens of scars that traced his skin like a map of suffering, yet his bones healed faster than Crow's textbooks allowed, and though his eyes sometimes appeared hollow, they carried a glimmer of strange awareness that unsettled even his mother Eliza, who now lived in a constant state of dread, torn between gratitude that her child still breathed and terror at what the doctor was shaping him into. Crow, intoxicated by his own discoveries, escalated his therapies into trials of endurance so grotesque that even hardened miners would have recoiled had they seen them, He exposed Samuel to extremes of heat and cold, measuring his pulse with obsessive care. He administered measured doses of arsenic, strychnine, and digitalis, recording how long before vomiting or delirium set in, then waiting with fascination as the boy recovered with impossible speed. And he sliced shallow wounds into Samuel's arms and legs, only to observe how quickly they sealed, photographing each stage with his imported camera, claiming he was building a visual archive that would astonish the world. But beneath Crow's methodical cruelty, a larger plan was forming, for letters from Washington had promised him not only recognition, but wealth and influence if he could deliver the Blackridge specimen alive. And thus Crow began making arrangements for transport, bribing wagon masters and plotting a route east through Denver, where a private train car would await. Yet he underestimated the resilience not only of the boy, but of the miners themselves, whose suspicions of Crow's experiments had hardened into anger after a second inspector vanished under mysterious circumstances, fueling talk of curses and devils in the infirmary. And though the company silenced such talk with threats of dismissal, whispers spread like wildfire in the saloons where whiskey loosened tongues. Samuel himself, though weakened by constant trials, had begun to cultivate his own survival strategy, storing fragments of wire, scraps of cloth, and stolen nails hidden under his bedding, fashioning crude tools with the ingenuity of a child who had learned in the mines that one's hands must always prepare for collapse. And at night, when Crow's attention drifted, Samuel practiced knots and traps, replaying every scream, every cut, every lie, until his rage crystallized into a plan. He would not leave Blackridge as property. And if Crow intended to carry him away, then the boy would choose instead to strike first. Eliza, sensing her son's hardening resolve, begged him to be patient, whispering that justice would come if only they endured until Crow overreached. But Samuel no longer trusted in justice, for had not the company already declared him dead? Had not the officials ignored his suffering? Had not every authority failed to protect him? And so he began to think like Crow himself, coolly, clinically, deciding that survival sometimes required a predator's heart. Meanwhile, Crow's growing arrogance brought new eyes upon him, for a Pinkerton agent named Silas Kane arrived in Blackridge under orders from Denver investors to investigate rumors of misconduct. And unlike the inspectors before him, Kane was no bureaucrat, but a former Union scout hardened by war, a man who recognized the smell of deceit the moment he stepped into the infirmary, where the air reeked of laudanum, scorched flesh, and secrecy. And though Crow tried to dazzle him with polished speeches and forged papers, Kane saw the fear etched on Eliza's face and the hollow resilience in Samuel's eyes, and he resolved quietly to dig deeper, even as Crow prepared to silence any threat to his scheme. As July heat turned the Rockies into an oven, tensions erupted when a cave-in killed 3 miners, and the survivors swore that the timbers had been weakened by neglect, while the company blamed worker carelessness, sparking near riots that forced the Pinkertons to patrol the camp with rifles. And amid this chaos, Kane shadowed Crow, gathering whispers from saloon keepers and mothers, piecing together a story too monstrous to believe, yet too consistent to dismiss, until he confronted Eliza in secret and urged her to testify against the doctor, promising federal protection if she cooperated. But Eliza, though desperate, feared that speaking would only provoke Crow to take Samuel east before authorities could intervene. The turning point came on August 3rd, when Crow attempted a new procedure he called the trial of limits, strapping Samuel to a table and administering escalating doses of morphine while forcing him to endure incisions that would have killed grown men. And though Samuel's body convulsed with agony, his eyes never left the doctor's face, and when he finally gasped words through cracked lips, they were not pleas, but a vow. "You will not own me." A declaration that startled even Crow, who for the first time in months felt a tremor of unease in the presence of his subject. but the doctor's obsession outweighed his fear, and within days he accelerated preparations for departure, arranging wagons and bribing guards, determined to remove Samuel from Blackridge before any authority could act, unaware that the boy was already waiting for him with weapons fashioned from his own instruments, and that the miners, weary of whispers, were ready to erupt into open defiance, setting the stage for a confrontation that would decide not only Samuel's fate, but the soul of Blackridge. By the time autumn settled over Blackridge in 1874, the mountains seemed to brood under clouds that refused to lift, and in the shadow of those peaks, the town had become a powder keg ready to explode. For miners whispered openly now that Dr. Nathaniel Crow was not a healer, but a butcher cloaked in science, and that the boy who had been dragged from the collapsed shaft was still alive somewhere inside the infirmary, though the company insisted he was long buried. And Samuel Hayes himself, though scarred and weakened by months of torment, had transformed inwardly into something Crow had never intended. A child no longer frightened of the doctor's scalpel, but sharpened by it, forged like steel in fire, his thoughts cold, methodical, waiting for the moment when predator and prey would trade places. Crow, meanwhile, prepared for departure eastward with an urgency that bordered on mania, arranging for wagons to carry medical trunks packed not with supplies, but with journals, instruments, and photographs that documented every cut and every recovery, evidence he meant to unveil before investors in Washington who dreamed of soldiers impervious to pain. And yet obstacles thickened around him, for Pinkerton agent Silas Kane had gathered testimonies from miners who swore they heard children's screams at midnight, from a widow who claimed Crow offered her coin to keep silent, even from Eliza Hayes, who in a whisper choked with fear, admitted her son lived still but was subjected to treatments that no mother should witness. Kane intended to ride for Denver with this evidence, but Crow, sensing the tightening noose, accelerated his plan and ordered Samuel prepared for transport, locking him in a wagon outfitted as a crude surgical cage, its iron bars concealed beneath canvas. Yet Samuel was not the compliant subject Crow imagined, for he had hidden beneath his bedding a sharpened nail bound to a splinter of wood, and as the wagon jolted down the rocky trail, he worked at the bindings until blood slicked his wrists, whispering to himself that pain was only another test, one he would not fail. And by the time Crow halted for nightfall near a gulch, Samuel had freed himself, crouching in the shadows of the wagon with eyes that no longer reflected the innocence of childhood, but the calculation of someone who had learned too much of suffering. When Crow approached with lamp in hand, intending to administer another dose of opiate to keep his specimen docile, the boy struck, plunging his crude weapon into the doctor's thigh before rolling beneath the wagon, vanishing into the dark gulch like a phantom, and Crow's howl carried across the camp, awakening guards who scrambled with rifles while the doctor bled into the dirt. Word of Samuel's escape spread through Blackridge within hours, igniting the camp like dry pine touched by flame, miners abandoning shafts to search the ridges, mothers clutching children as if shielding them from unseen horrors. And by dawn, Kane had taken charge of the hunt, declaring openly that the boy's survival proved Crow's deceptions, and that the doctor would answer for crimes darker than any committed by the company. Crow, limping and enraged, insisted that Samuel was dangerous, unfit for society, a creature reshaped by unnatural endurance, and he swore that only by recapturing him could catastrophe be prevented. But the miners, long resentful of his secrecy, no longer listened, and when Eliza Hayes appeared among them demanding her son be found before Crow laid another hand on him, the camp erupted in shouts that no Pinkerton could quiet. Samuel, meanwhile, moved through the mountain woods with uncanny stealth, guided by instincts sharpened during endless nights of torment, building snares from branches, stealing food from abandoned cabins, watching the searchers with eyes that measured distance, angle, and opportunity the way Crow once measured his pulse. And as days passed, he began to leave signs not of weakness but of intent, symbols carved in bark, bloody cloth tied to branches, trails that led nowhere. Psychological warfare learned not from books, but from surviving Crow's endless trials. Kane recognized these signs as deliberate, evidence that the boy was not fleeing in terror, but shaping the hunt itself. And he warned the miners that Samuel might be preparing for something none of them understood. Yet in private, Cain admitted to Eliza that the boy's resilience, though extraordinary, was the product of cruelty that had stripped him of childhood, and whatever emerged from the woods would no longer be the son she remembered, but someone altered forever. The standoff reached its climax on September 12th, when Crow, defying Cain's orders, ventured into the gulch alone, carrying a pistol and a satchel of instruments as if he believed he could resume his experiments in the wilderness. And what happened that night remained tangled in rumor. Some said Samuel ambushed him with traps made from rope and stone. Others whispered the boy lured him with a child's voice, then struck with Crow's own scalpel. But by morning, miners found the doctor's body hanging from a tree, his chest carved with precise incisions that mirrored those he had once inflicted, his eyes staring upward as though forced to witness his own undoing. Samuel was nowhere to be seen, but near the body lay Crow's leather-bound journals, pages soaked in blood, yet still legible. And when Cain read them aloud to the gathered crowd, the truth spilled out like poison. Experiments catalogued in cold detail, letters to buyers in Washington, plans to replicate endurance through deliberate torment, all written in a hand too precise to deny. Outrage thundered through the camp, and the company, desperate to smother scandal, declared Crow a rogue acting without sanction. Yet no one in Blackridge believed such convenient lies, and Samuel Hayes, the boy who should have died beneath stone, had now become a ghost of the mountains. A figure mothers invoked to frighten children into obedience, a name miners spoke in low voices when the wind howled through abandoned shafts. Eliza never found her son again, though in nights when the fire burned low, she swore she heard him outside the shack, whispering promises that he would never let men like Crow hurt others. And Cain, in his final report, wrote words that haunted him for years. The boy is alive, and he has learned the lessons of pain too well. He is no longer a patient, but a weapon. And whether he uses that knowledge for justice or vengeance, the choice will belong only to himself. In the years that followed Dr. Nathaniel Crow's death, the town of Blackridge wore its silence like a shroud. The company erasing records, investors fleeing scandal, and officials insisting that the physician's crimes were the work of one deranged man rather than a system that had fed upon the weak. Yet rumors refused to die. For miners swore that on cold nights when wind howled through empty shafts, they still heard the cries of a boy, and travelers whispered of a pale figure moving through the pines with eyes that glimmered like coals. And so Samuel Hayes, though unseen, became legend, a ghost child forged by pain, haunting the Rockies with vengeance in his heart. Eliza Hayes left Blackridge with what little she owned, relocating to a textile mill town on the plains, where she tried to rebuild life for her surviving children. But the absence of Samuel carved at her daily, for though she prayed he lived, she also feared what he might have become. And at night she dreamed of him standing silent at the foot of her bed, scars glistening like pale rivers, eyes watching without warmth. Meanwhile, Silas Cain, the Pinkerton agent who had uncovered Crow's journals, carried those blood-stained volumes eastward, delivering them to authorities who debated in secret whether the discoveries inside were horror or opportunity. And though the official line was that the documents were destroyed, whispers among physicians told of passages copied, diagrams preserved, theories shared quietly in medical circles, meaning that Crow's work, though discredited, had already seeded curiosity among men ambitious enough to imagine soldiers who healed faster than bullets could kill. Samuel himself wandered for years along the mountain frontier, living by instincts sharpened in captivity, avoiding towns except to steal food or tools, sleeping in abandoned cabins or caves where he traced symbols into stone as if writing his own scripture of survival. And though he remained unseen, traces of his presence unsettled those who stumbled upon them. Ropes knotted into traps across trails, fire pits with bones too cleanly stripped, journals written in a child's scrawl that described pain not with fear but with analysis, as though suffering had become his language. By 1877, reports of a boy who looked far older than his years began surfacing in mining towns from Leadville to Silverton. Stories of a wiry youth who stepped in when overseers beat children, who fought grown men with a ferocity disproportionate to his size, who vanished before thanks could be given. And some believed he was myth, while others swore they had seen his eyes, hard as mountain ice, staring from the edge of firelight. Eliza heard these tales second-hand and wept, torn between hope that her son was alive and terror that he was becoming what Crow had tried to shape, a vessel of endurance without mercy. But she never stopped waiting, leaving a lamp burning each night until her death in 1881, when neighbors found her clutching Samuel's childhood blanket as though expecting him to return. Kane, older now and weary of the Pinkerton life, retired to Denver yet kept a locked trunk beneath his floorboards containing Crow's journals and sketches, for though he hated them, he could not bring himself to burn them, knowing that somewhere Samuel might one day need proof of what had been done to him. And Kane often wondered whether the boy's silence was protection or preparation, whether he drifted like smoke or planned like fire. In 1883, a violent strike at a coal mine in Wyoming brought Samuel back into whispers when armed guards cornered a group of child laborers inside a shaft, intent on smoking them out. And witnesses claimed a stranger emerged from the dark wielding nothing but a sharpened pick, moving with such precision and fury that armed men fled, leaving the children alive but trembling. And when asked their rescuer's name, they answered only the Scarred Boy, descriptions matching Samuel, though by then he would have been 20, his youth spent in shadows. Newspapers spun the tale into folklore, yet officials buried it, fearing unrest, and Samuel's legend grew not from fact but from what men needed to believe, that somewhere in the mountains a protector existed, one who had survived what no child should and now punished those who preyed upon the weak. Yet Samuel himself, in journals later found in an abandoned cabin near the Arkansas River, revealed no pride in heroics, but only exhaustion, writing in a script jagged with cold. "I do not save them because I am good. I save them because I cannot watch Crow's hands repeat themselves, and every cry drags me back to the table where I learned that pain is the truest language of men." By the late 1880s, the legend of the Scarred Boy had grown into a frontier myth, campfire tales told to frighten cruel bosses and inspire children alike. But beneath the myth, Samuel endured alone, haunted by scars that never faded, and instincts that would never let him rest, a wanderer between life and death, shaped forever by a doctor who believed pain could be measured. And though the world moved forward with railroads, factories, and progress, Samuel Hayes remained an echo of Blackridge, a living reminder that survival sometimes births not hope, but shadows. By the turn of the century, the legend of Samuel Hayes had become as much a part of Rocky Mountain folklore as lost mines and phantom trains, though few alive could separate truth from embellishment, for some swore he had died decades earlier, while others insisted he still roamed the high country, unchanged by time, a scarred sentinel haunting timberline ridges where storms gathered without warning. And in saloons old miners leaned close to tell of a man with the body of youth but eyes that belonged to an old soldier, who appeared when children were beaten or when foremen pressed starving men to work collapsing shafts, striking with surgical precision, then vanishing before sunrise. In Denver, aging Silas Kane grew obsessed with these tales, for though he had left the Pinkertons behind, his nights were never free of Crow's journals, those pages of cruelty he still kept locked away. And when newspapers reported in 1902 that a group of child workers had been pulled alive from a burning textile mill by a silent stranger scarred like stitched leather, Cain knew beyond doubt that Samuel still lived, carrying the ghost of Crow with him into every rescue, every strike of vengeance. Yet Cain also knew that legends had a way of consuming the living, and he feared Samuel was becoming not a protector, but a revenant, doomed to repeat pain endlessly, a weapon forged by one man's madness. Meanwhile, Samuel himself, in scattered fragments of writing found years later, revealed the toll his endurance had exacted, scribbling lines that read like confessions. "Every wound heals, but none vanish. They live inside my sleep. They teach me that flesh can forget, but memory cannot." And another, "I am not saving them, I am erasing him, piece by piece, but the erasure is never complete." By 1910, the expansion of industry had pushed deeper into Colorado's mountains, and once again accidents multiplied. Children crushed in machinery or suffocated in shafts, and with them came new sightings of a scarred man intervening with uncanny foresight, as though he smelled disaster before it struck, leading the young to safety while leaving overseers trembling with broken bones, and company agents whispered that they were hunted by a ghost born of Blackridge, a ghost they could not kill. In 1914, when labor wars erupted in Colorado, miners at Ludlow claimed that amid the chaos of gunfire, a figure moved through smoke, pulling children from tents before flames consumed them. And though official reports made no mention, survivors insisted the scarred man was there, silent, efficient, a phantom who vanished into the hills before soldiers could see. But Samuel was no phantom, only a man scarred beyond recognition, carrying a childhood stolen in a stone infirmary. And as the decades passed, his body betrayed him slowly, endurance stretching years but not granting immortality, his scars thickening, his bones aching with the weight of what he had carried. In 1921, Silas Kane, near death in Denver, confessed to his nephew that Samuel Hayes was real, not a myth, and gave him Crow's journals with strict instructions to destroy them, warning that the world would always have men eager to repeat Crow's work if proof remained. And though the nephew promised, he instead locked them away, unable to burn history, ensuring that the seeds of cruelty might one day sprout again. In 1923, a rumor spread that a scarred man had died in a boarding house near Pueblo, buried under the name John Doe, his chest marked by dozens of healed incisions, his body still powerful, though his hair had gone white. And some believed it was Samuel's end, though others dismissed it as coincidence, for legends do not die so simply. What is certain is that in the same year, Eliza Hayes's grave in the Plains town where she had died decades earlier was found disturbed, not robbed, but tended. Fresh flowers laid with a child's blanket folded neatly at its base, a gesture only Samuel could have made, suggesting that even at the end he carried his mother's memory like the one tether strong enough to pull him from shadow. And so the story closes where it began, with a boy who should have died beneath stone, but instead walked out alive, only to be trapped by a doctor's obsession, surviving not because fate was kind, but because his body refused to break. And though he lived long enough to turn vengeance into legend, Samuel Hayes never escaped the truth that he was forged in pain, a living testament to the danger of men who seek progress without conscience. And today, when hikers tread the ruins of forgotten mines and hear echoes like pick strikes or faint cries in the wind, they sometimes wonder if the scarred boy still walks among the peaks, watching, waiting, ensuring that no child suffers alone in the dark. And whether ghost or man or memory, his presence lingers, reminding all who hear his story that survival is never free. It demands a price that scars not just flesh, but the soul itself.